get lost, get crazy in the name of love. Luther and the Slow Walk of Love, but what his marriage reveals about commitment today.
Yes, a biblical man wrote an interesting article on Substack entitled Luther Didn't Love His Wife When He Married Her. When Martin Luther married Katharina von Bora in 1525, he did not do so from burning romantic passion, but from a sense of duty to provide for a former nun, to honor his own teachings on marriage, and to spite the devil, as he colorfully put it. Yet this marriage, begun without romance, became one of history's most profound testimonies about how covenant transforms obligation into genuine love. Their story challenges our culture's gospel of following your heart, suggesting instead that the heart follows where commitment leads. In an age where we're told authentic love must feel effortless and emotionally validated at every turn, Luther's journey from reluctant groom to devoted husband offers a radically different and perhaps more honest map of how love actually grows in the real world of dishes, disagreements, and shared mortality.
Interesting topic today, Mr. Mike. We're constantly told that marrying for love is the only authentic option, that anything else is setting or even morally suspect. But what's the pretty recent idea? What did marriage actually look like before our modern romantic revolution?
It's crucial to understand that for most of human history, and certainly throughout the biblical and early Christian periods, marriage was fundamentally understood as a covenant rather than a feeling based contract. When we look at scripture, we see marriage constantly framed in covenantal terms. The prophet Malachi called his wife your companion and your wife by covenant, using the Hebrew word berith, the same term used for God's covenant with Israel. This is an accidental language. A covenant, unlike our modern contracts, wasn't primarily about mutual satisfaction, but about a binding commitment that creates a new reality regardless of emotional fluctuation. The early church fathers reinforced this covenantal understanding with remarkable consistency. John Chrysostom, preaching in 4th century Antioch, told husbands that marriage does not have as its purpose pleasure or the enjoyment of beauty, but the begetting of children and the rearing of a family. Yet he immediately clarified this wasn't cold pragmatism. Rather, the covenant itself became the crucible where authentic love was forged. In his homilies on Ephesians, Chrysostom wrote that the husband should love his wife as Christ loved the church, emphasizing that this love, agape, was fundamentally sacrificial and volitional rather than emotion dependent. He insisted husbands should be willing to give up your very life for her, not because she makes you happy, but because the covenant demands it. Augustine of Hippo articulated what he called the three goods of marriage: prolos, offspring, fides, fidelity, and sacramentum, the sacred bond. Notice what's absent from this framework: romantic fulfillment, personal happiness, or emotional compatibility. In his treatise on the good of marriage, Augustine argued that the sacramentum, the indissoluble sacred bond, was actually the highest good because it reflected Christ's unbreakable union with the church. The marriage wasn't validated by feeling, but the objective reality of the covenant made before God and the community. This covenantal understanding dominated Christian thought for over 15 centuries. Even Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, while acknowledging friendship as an important dimension of marriage, placed the covenant's legal and sacramental dimensions as foundational. The Summa Theologica treats marriage primarily under law and sacrament, not under the passions or emotions. Medieval marriage liturgies focused on vows, public witness, and blessing, the creation of an objective bond rather than the couple's subjective feelings. The historical reversal came gradually through several cultural shifts. The Protestant Reformation, ironically, planted some seeds by emphasizing marriage as a companion relationship rather than merely contract or inferior spiritual state. Luther himself maintained the covenantal priority. We'll explore his personal journey shortly. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, however, fundamentally reoriented the cultural understanding. Thinkers like Rousseau elevated authentic feeling as the primary sources of meaning, and romantic love became idealized as the ultimate human experience. But the real revolution happened in the 20th century with the rise of what sociologists call expressive individualism, the belief that authentic selfhood requires freely chosen relationships that facilitate personal growth and emotional fulfillment. Marriage increasingly became seen not as a covenant that shapes you, but as a choice that expresses you. The statistician and relationship researcher Eli Finkel has documented this shift, noting that contemporary Americans expect marriage to fulfill higher order needs, self actualization, emotional support, and personal growth that previous generations sought elsewhere or didn't prioritize at all. The Apostle Paul's instructions in Ephesians 5 reveal how foreign our modern framework would be to early Christians. When Paul tells husbands to love wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, he's describing a love that precedes and creates the beloved's beauty rather than responding to it. Christ didn't love the church because she was lovely, his love made her lovely. This is covenantal logic. The commitment creates the conditions for love to flourish, not the reverse. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD in his Stramata, emphasized that Christian marriage exists not for the sake of pleasure, but for the maintenance of the family and the succession of children and the perfection of the world. Yet he immediately adds that within this covenantal structure, true affection develops precisely because duty provides the secure foundation for vulnerability. What we've lost in our romantic revolution is the biblical and patristic understanding that covenant doesn't oppose love, it produces it. The early Christian vision wasn't coldly utilitarian, it was profoundly realistic about human beings actually learn to love over time. Tertullian, writing in the late second century, beautifully described Christian couples who are truly two in the flesh, and one flesh where the flesh is one also is the spirit. Together they pray, together they perform their fasts, mutually teaching, mutually exhorting, mutually sustaining. This unity didn't emerge from initial attraction, but from the daily practice of covenant faithfulness. The modern reversal tells us that authentic love must come first, that commitment without passion is hypocrisy, that duty kills desire. The ancient Christian vision insisted the opposite. That commitment creates the space where authentic love can grow. That passion without covenant is unsustainable, and that duty, rightly understood, doesn't kill desire, but directs it toward reality rather than fantasy. We've essentially inverted the biblical order, expecting the fruit before we planted the tree. In conclusion, understanding this historical reversal helps us see that our modern romantic assumptions aren't universal truths, but recent cultural inventions. And this recognition opens space to reconsider whether the ancient covenantal path might actually be wiser.
So, Mr. Merck, let's dig into Luther's story specifically. What do we actually know about how his marriage to Katharina began and what motivated this man who'd been to celibate monk to suddenly marry?
Martin Luther's marriage to Katharina von Bora stands as one of history's most remarkable demonstrations of how covenant love develops from unpromising beginnings. The historical record reveals a union begun not from romantic attraction, but from theological conviction, social obligation, and Luther, being Luther, a hefty dose of defiant humor. Understanding the context requires grasping the revolutionary nature of what Luther was doing and his own conflicted feelings about it. By 1525, Luther had been promoting clerical marriage for several years as part of his broader theological reforms. His treatise on monastic vows argued that mandatory celibacy was unbiblical, and that most people lacked the rare gift of celibacy. Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians. Luther wrote, "It is neither commanded nor counseled that everyone should remain celibate. Rather, it is a free gift given to a few, as Christ says in Matthew 19. He'd helped numerous monks and nuns leave religious orders and supported their marriages. Yet Luther himself remained single. apparently viewing his own situation as different, giving his outlaw status and the genuine danger he faced. The catalyst came when Katharina von Bora, a Cistercian nun Luther had helped escape from the convent, found herself in Wittenberg without marriage prospects. Of the 12 nuns who escaped, all but Katharina had married or returned to their families. Contemporary accounts suggest Luther had attempted to arrange matches for her with at least two other men, but these fell through. Katharina herself reportedly indicated she would marry Luther or Luther's colleague, but no one else, a remarkably bold statement for a woman in her precarious position. Luther's own writings reveal his decidedly unromantic motivations. In a letter to Nicholas von Amsdorf, dated June 21st, 1525, shortly after his marriage, Luther wrote, "The rumor is true that I was suddenly married to Catherine. I did this to silence the evil mouths which are so used to complaining about me. I also did it to spite the devil and the Pope." To another friend, he wrote even more bluntly, "I am not madly in love, but I cherish my wife." This wasn't the language of sweeping romance, but of pragmatic decision making grounded in principle. Several factors converged to push Luther toward marriage despite his reluctance. First, theological consistency demanded it. How could he insist clerical celibacy was wrong while remaining celibate himself? His opponents were gleefully pointing out this apparent hypocrisy. Second, the German Peasants' War had just concluded bloodily, and Luther faced intense criticism for his harsh response. Marrying demonstrated confidence in normal life continuing despite upheaval. Third, Luther's father, Hans, had long urged him to marry and provide grandchildren, a form of filial obligation Luther took seriously. Fourth, Catherine's situation genuinely concerned him. She had no family protection and limited options. Fifth, at 42, Luther was increasingly aware of his mortality and the practical needs of his household. Yet none of these motivations resembled romantic love as we conceive it. Luther himself described his motivations in a letter written in November 1524, before his marriage, but when he was considering the possibility. "If I can manage it, before I die, I will still marry my Katie to spite the devil, should I hear that the peasants continue their rumpus." Notice the framing. It's about theological witness, social disruption, and defiance, not personal fulfillment or emotional connection. The wedding itself reflected this unconventional beginning. Luther married Katharina quickly and without fanfare on June 13, 1525, with only a handful of witnesses present, including three of his friends. A public celebration followed 2 weeks later, but the initial ceremony was almost furtive. This wasn't a man radiating joy at finding his soulmate, but someone fulfilling what he saw as his duty. The early Christian understanding of marriage would have recognized Luther's approach as entirely legitimate. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD in his epistle to Polycarp, instructed, "It is fitting for men and women who marry to be united with the consent of the bishop, and the marriage may be according to the Lord and man, not according to lust." Notice that romantic feeling isn't mentioned as a prerequisite. What matters is proper intention and public commitment. The consent of the church, represented by the bishop, validates the marriage, not the intensity of mutual attraction. John Chrysostom specifically addressed the question of whether one should delay marriage until finding someone with overwhelming attraction. In his homilies, he argued against this, insisting that character and virtue were far more important considerations than initial feelings. "Do not, I pray, look for beauty in a wife, lest her beauty become the cause of adultery. Do not require money, lest the marriage become more painful than poverty." Instead, he urged men to seek gentleness, modesty, and piety, and trust their affection would develop within the marital covenant. This ancient Christian wisdom directly contradicts our culture's romantic script that insists you must feel in love before committing. The church fathers would have viewed Luther's practical, duty driven approach as perfectly appropriate, even commendable. They understood what modern research has repeatedly confirmed. Initial attraction is a poor predictor of long term marital satisfaction. Psychologist Tom Tashiro notes in his research on marriage decisions that people consistently overweight easily observable characteristics: physical attractiveness, charisma, and underweight, harder to assess traits: emotional regulation, reliability, compatibility of life goals when choosing partners based on feeling. The Jewish wisdom tradition similarly emphasized practical virtue over romantic attraction. Proverbs 31:30 declares, "Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised." The emphasis consistently falls on character, covenant faithfulness, and complementary purpose rather than emotional intoxication. The Hebrew concept of love is fundamentally an action and commitment rather than primarily a feeling. The verb form means to act lovingly toward as much as to feel love for. What's striking about Luther's reluctant beginning is how honestly it mirrors many biblical marriages. Isaac and Rebekah were matched by a servant based on family suitability and God's guidance, not personal attraction. Jacob worked 7 years to marry Rachel, but this reflected commitment to his goal, not necessarily overwhelming mutual passion at first sight. David's multiple marriages were largely political and practical. Even Joseph and Mary's relationship began with dutiful obedience to God's disruptive call rather than romantic choice. Luther's letters from this period throughout the time thinking about marriage was about a man uncertain about his decision, but committed to following through because he believed it was right. To his friend, July 1525, he wrote, "My situation is very pleasant and agreeable. May God be praised. I am content, and my Katie too. She is helpful to me in everything." The contentment he describes sounds more like a relief at a good decision made than rather than romantic ecstasy, and there's profound honesty in that. The cultural pressure to validate every marriage decision with passionate feeling actually increases anxiety and instability. If I'm supposed to feel overwhelmingly attraction to justify marrying, what does it mean when those feelings naturally fluctuate? The covenantal approach removes this burden. Luther didn't need to convince himself or others that Katharina made his heart race. He needed only to recognize that marrying her was the right action given his circumstances, beliefs, and commitments. The covenant would do the rest. In conclusion, Luther's reluctant, duty driven beginning wasn't a liability to overcome, but the proper foundation for what would become genuine, lasting love. A foundation we'll explore as we trace how his relationship transformed over time.
So, Mr. Mick, okay, so Luther married Katharina without romantic feelings, out of duty, spy toward the devil, and theologically consistency, but their marriage actually becomes something beautiful, didn't it? How did that happen? What transformed obligation to genuine love?
The transformation of Luther's marriage offers a profound case study in how covenant commitment creates the conditions for authentic love to emerge and deepen. The historical record reveals a relationship that evolved from pragmatic partnership to genuine affection, mutual respect, and deep companionship, not despite its unromantic beginning, but precisely because the covenant provided a secure framework within which real intimacy could develop. The key to understanding this transformation lies in recognizing that Luther and Katharina weren't waiting passively for feelings to arrive. They were actively building a life together. And in that building, love emerged as a byproduct of shared work, mutual support, and covenant faithfulness. Within 3 years of marriage, Luther's letters reveal a dramatically different tone. Writing to friends in 1528, he refers to Katharina affectionately as my Lord Katie and my rib, a playful reference to Genesis 2:22. In 1534, he was writing, "I would not exchange my Katie for France and Venice," calling her my dear wife, whom I love beyond measure. This progression wasn't coincidental. It reflected the principles the church fathers articulated about how marital love actually develops. Augustine, in On the Good of Marriage, argued that the covenant itself, the sacramentum, creates a fellowship of some kind that naturally deepens through shared experience. He wrote, "In our marriage, the good which is sought is not so much a matter of procreation as of the natural companionship between the two sexes. Otherwise, we would not speak of marriage in the case of old people." Augustine recognized that companionship emerges from the covenant persistence, not from initial chemistry. What specifically transformed Luther's marriage? Several factors worked in concert, all grounded in the daily practice of covenant faithfulness. First, the crucible of shared life created genuine knowledge and intimacy. Luther and Caterina's household was chaotic, a former monastery, housing students, refugees, relatives, and frequent visitors, all requiring management. They eventually had 6 children together. Caterina took charge of the household finances, managed a small farm, brewed beer commercially, and cared for boarders. Luther's letters reveal his growing respect for her competence. Katie, my rib, is in all things so obliging and pleasing to me that I would not exchange my poverty for the riches of Croesus. This mutual dependence fostered genuine appreciation. Tertullian, in his To His Wife, described how Christian couples mutually sustaining each other through daily challenges creates bonds deeper than initial attraction. They have no concealment from each other. They have nothing to fear from each other. They have no reason to shun each other. The vulnerability of shared life, seeing each other during illness, failure, exhaustion, and stress, either destroys a relationship or deepens it into something more solid than romantic idealization can provide. Second, covenant security enabled emotional risk and authentic connection. Modern attachment theory research has confirmed what the church fathers intuited. Secure commitment creates the safety necessary for genuine intimacy. Psychologist Sue Johnson's work on emotionally focused therapy demonstrates that felt security in the relationship bond enables partners to be vulnerable, seek comfort, and express needs, the very behaviors that create emotional closeness. Luther's growing affection for Caterina wasn't manufactured. It emerged naturally as their covenant commitment made it safe to be known. His letters show increasing comfort, expressing need and dependence. When ill in 1537, he wrote to Caterina with tender vulnerability: I have been weak and remain so. I need your presence and help. This is radically different from the self sufficient tone of his earlier letters. The covenant's permanence paradoxically enabled him to acknowledge dependence without fearing it would be weaponized or exploited. Third, the act of sacrificial love produced the feeling of love. This inverts our cultural assumption that feeling must precede action. The biblical and patristic tradition consistently taught that loving action creates loving feeling. Jesus' command to love our enemies would be absurd if love were merely emotion. You can't command feelings, but you can command actions, and those actions shape our emotional reality. Luther embodied this through concrete acts of covenant faithfulness. He trusted Caterina with significant financial authority at a time when this was unusual. He publicly defended her against critics who mocked her boldness. He remained faithful despite spending months away traveling. Each act of sacrificial love, choosing Caterina's interests alongside or even above his own, reinforced his emotional bond to her. Gregory of Nazianzus, preaching in the 4th century, explained this dynamic. The man who truly loves his wife will consider her interests paramount to his own and will bear all things with her and endure them joyfully. Gregory understood that sacrificial action doesn't flow from pre existing feeling. Rather, the discipline of sacrificial action produces the feeling of love as we invest ourselves in another's well being. Fourth, shared suffering forged unbreakable bonds. Luther and Caterina buried 2 daughters, Elizabeth in infancy and Magdalena at age 13. These shared griefs created a depth of connection that pleasure seeking would never produce. Luther's anguished letter after Magdalena's death reveals a man sharing profound sorrow with his life as a partner in grief. We ought to give thanks and rejoice that God took her up into his kingdom. The early Christian understanding of marriage recognized that covenant most powerfully manifests its strength in suffering. Cyprian of Carthage, writing in the 3rd century, told married Christians facing persecution, let neither wife separate from husband, nor husband from wife, even in the hour of death and torture. Why? Because covenant is precisely for suffering. It's the framework that enables us to endure what we cannot endure alone. Shared suffering either destroys a relationship or sanctifies it, and covenant commitment ensures it does the latter. Fifth, the daily choice to honor covenant commitments gradually reshaped Luther's heart. This reflects the biblical principle of habituation, that repeated actions form character and shape desire. Paul's instructions to husbands in Ephesians 5 is a command to act lovingly. The emotional reality follows the volitional commitment as we become what we practice. Thomas Aquinas, building on Aristotle's virtue ethics, argued that virtue, including the virtue of marital love, develops due repeated action good acts. By doing just acts, we become just. By doing brave acts, we become brave. Applied to marriage, by acting lovingly, serving, forgiving, sacrificing, even when we don't initially feel overwhelming affection, we become loving people who genuinely feel love. Luther's transformation reflected this pattern. His consistent choice to honor his marriage covenant gradually reshaped his affections until Caterina became genuinely precious to him. Sixth, their shared mission and purpose created unity beyond themselves. Luther and Caterina weren't just living for their own happiness, they were advancing the Reformation, providing sanctuary for refugees, training the next generation of ministers, and modeling Protestant family life to a watching world. This shared purpose beyond personal fulfillment created a bond of mission partnership. The New Testament concept of marriage consistently frames it as fundamentally purposeful rather than merely pleasurable. Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians 7 treat marriage as one way, but not the only way to serve God's purposes faithfully. Peter calls wives and husbands heirs together of the grace of life, emphasizing their shared spiritual purpose. When couples unite around a purpose beyond their relationship, the relationship paradoxically grows stronger because it's not the bearing weight of being each person's sole source of meaning. Seventh, forgiveness and grace become daily practice, creating unsustainable love. Luther was famously difficult, moody, stubborn, sometimes crude, prone to black depressions. Caterina was strong willed, direct, and unyielding in managing their chaotic household. They had conflicts. Luther once wrote to a friend, half jokingly, there is a lot to get used to in the first year of marriage. One wakes up in the morning and finds a pair of pigtails on the pillow that were not there before. Yet their covenant forced them to develop forgiveness as a habit rather than as an occasional crisis intervention. Ambrose of Milan, writing in the fourth century, taught married couples that daily forgiveness was essential. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Paul teaches this, saying, do not let the sun set on your anger. Why? Because the night may take away the opportunity for peacemaking. The covenant creates both the necessity and safety of ongoing reconciliation. You can't escape, so you must forgive. And because you're committed to staying, forgiveness isn't manipulation, but genuine release. The transformation of Luther's marriage wasn't magical or mysterious. It was the natural result of two people faithfully practicing covenant commitment over years. Luther moved from, I am not madly in love, to, I would not exchange my Katie for France and Venice, not because he discovered hidden compatibility or because Caterina became different, but because the daily practice of covenant faithfulness created genuine fruit as its love as a result. Modern research consistently validates this ancient wisdom. Psychologist Gary Chapman's long term research on marriages found that couples who stay together through difficulties rather than leaving when feelings faded often reported falling back in love after weathering storms together. The commitment created the container. Their perseverance through challenges created the depth. The result was love stronger than initial infatuation could ever produce. In conclusion, Luther's transformation reveals that covenant doesn't merely allow love to survive, it actively creates and deepens love through the daily practice of faithfulness, sacrifice, and grace, suggesting we might profitably examine how this covenant love differs from the romantic ideal our culture prizes.
Interesting, Mr. Meg. So I think a lot of people would hear Luther's story and think, okay, that's nice for him, but that's setting it's giving up on a real passion and chemistry. How would you respond to that? What is the actual differences between covenant love and romantic love, and why should we prefer the former?
The question strikes at the heart of our cultural confusion about love. We must clearly distinguish between what I'm calling covenant love and romantic love because treating them as interchangeable has caused immense suffering and instability in modern marriages. They're not simply different degrees of the same thing, they're fundamentally different orientations toward relationships that lead to radically different outcomes. Let's begin by defining our terms precisely. Romantic love, as our culture understands it, is fundamentally a feeling based approach to a relationship that prioritizes emotional intensity, personal fulfillment, and authentic self expression. It's characterized by passion as the primary indicator of validity. When you know, you know, the beloved as the source of one's happiness and identity, the you complete me ideal. Compatibility as discovered rather than built, conditional commitment dependent on sustained satisfaction, and the relationship serving individual self actualization as its highest purpose. Romantic love asks, does this person make me happy? Do I feel attracted? Does this relationship allow me to be my authentic self? Covenant love, by contrast, is a commitment based approach that prioritizes fidelity, mutual service, and shared purpose. It's characterized by vows as the foundation, regardless of emotional fluctuation, mutual responsibility for each other's well being and growth, compatibility as actively constructed through sacrifice and adaptation, unconditional commitment independent of circumstances or feelings, and the relationship serving purposes beyond individual happiness, children, community, witness, mutual satisfaction. Covenant love asks, what does faithfulness require of me today? How can I serve my spouse's good? How can we together fulfill our calling? These aren't complementary approaches, they're rival visions within incompatible assumptions. The New Testament consistently presents marriage in covenantal rather than romantic terms. Paul's extended teachings in Ephesians 5 presents Christ's relationship with the church as the template, and that relationship is emphatically covenantal. Christ didn't choose the church because she made him fulfilled or because of natural compatibility. He loved the church and gave himself up for her to accomplish redemptive purpose. The love is demonstrated through sacrifice, gave himself up, not through emotional satisfaction. The church fathers understood this distinction clearly, even if they didn't use our modern terminology. John Chrysostom's homilies on marriage explicitly contrasted marriage motivated by beauty or pleasure, what we'd call romantic love, with marriage grounded in covenant. Notice the paradox. Covenant love makes difficulty bearable. Toil itself is love, while romantic love makes even pleasant things burdensome when feelings fade. Not so much can be said on Luther's marriage, but let's end with part one. But I look forward to part two of this series about Luther and his expanding transformation. In conclusion, this is a direct warning against romantic love's priority on attraction and compatibility as discovered traits, urging instead the covenantal focus on character that enables faithfulness.
Faithfulness, faithfulness indeed. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Mr. Meg, thank you, thank you, thank you. Luther and his slow work of love, what is a marriage reveals about commitment today, reflects on the emotional philosophy embodied by Luther Vandross, an artist whose music consistently honored patience and vulnerability and intentional love. Through his ballads or companion form of commitment that resisted haze and spectacle. Mr. Mink, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. That's GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD. Connect with me on LinkedIn, listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast, pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon. That is Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter.
Yes, indeed. People, let's support Mr. Mink, the Doctor Digital, and please do listen to our other podcasts, Music 101, Sex 101, and Mental Health 101, wherever you listen your podcasts. So, Mr. Mink, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, Deus Volt.
Welcome, people. See you soon.